Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Norway and a trial that is now underway there about an incident that occurred in August 2019. A young man by the name of Philip Manchos had killed not only his ethnic Chinese stepsister, but also then went to the Al-Noor Islamic Center, which is based around 20 kilometers from the Norwegian capital, Oslo, and tried to shoot up the mosque, but luckily didn't kill anybody in that specific case. When it came to the mosque, he was actually fought back, i.e. a couple of the people who were still in the mosque. It was the day of Eid. One remembers that this occurred last year. The trial has now begun. Philip Manchos has now spoken about the fact that he wants to talk about emergency justice, which is a concept within Norway in which a person had no choice but to commit a crime. He's also spoken in very great detail about a lot of his very racist views, be it towards Jews, Muslims, or others, or just migrants in general. And he wishes that he had, in fact, done more. It's known that he found a lot of inspiration within Brenton Tarrant, the Christchurch shooting as well that took place in New Zealand. So all of this, of course, put together paints a very disturbing picture. And that's what I want to put to my guests who are joining us now. Joining us, both of our guests, in fact, joining us from the Norwegian capital, Oslo. Bjorn Ihler is the co-founder of the Khalifa Ihler Institute, and Martine Aurdal is an op-ed editor and political commentator with Dagbladet. Martine and Bjorn, thank you both for your time today. Martine, let me start with you. What do you make of the Manchos, the trial as it holds right now? You know, when he entered the court and when he sat down, he made that OK sign, which is a sign of white supremacy. Why exactly is this happening again in a way in Norway? Because we had the Anders Behring Breivik incident as well.
There is a direct line from Anders Behring Breivik and his terror attack to Philip Manchos and his. It goes through the new kind of solo terrorism that we have seen arise in right-wing extreme right-wing areas or ideology during the last few years. And as you mentioned, he was directly inspired by Brenton Tarrant, who in his place said he was inspired by Breivik. They go to the dark web. Manchos directly searched for identity and ideology in 4chan and 8chan and radicalized himself during just a couple of years and found inspiration in Nazi ideology and racism. And he explains in court that he felt chosen by Tarrant this terror attack happened just 12 days after he read Tarrant's so-called manifesto.
Bjorn, what are your thoughts on this? Because I was reading today, Bjorn, that this gentleman, Manchos, is actually quite wealthy. He owns a number of properties as well. So, I mean, on paper, it seems, Bjorn, at least, that this should not be a young man who would be acting out in such an extreme fashion. What do you think may have pushed him to it, though?
I think there are different root causes for extremism, and poverty is not necessarily always, in all cases, one of them. Well, we see that poverty leads to the recruitment of people to militias, etc., places where that is something that people are economically reliant on. In typical far-right extremism in Western Europe, you see that people tend to be fairly well off. And so I think, as Martina touched upon, there's elements of wanting to search for an identity, wanting to find something bigger, wanting to find a sense of belonging. And I think Tarrant found that in Philip Manchos as well, found that in very toxic communities online. And I think that's true for Tarrant, and I think it's true for Breivik as well, that all of these people were fairly well off at the surface of it, but suffered as individuals and tried to find their place and found it in toxic environments.
Martine, what role do you think Norwegian politicians and politics may play in pushing someone to such right-wing views? I mean, there has been, hasn't there, a concern about sort of right-wing politics in Norway for a number of years now, hasn't there?
We have had a quite difficult discussion, I'll say, about to what extent does it matter, or to what extent does the anti or immigration discussion in the mainstream politics affect those searching for right-wing ideas. However, both Breivik and Manshaus concluded that democracy isn't enough because they don't think Manshaus said in court on Thursday that no politicians are fighting his case. You only have what he calls just, a right-wing party not even close enough to maintaining the anti-immigrant policy that he thinks is good enough. And our furthest right-wing party in Parliament, Fremskrittspartiet, Breivik was a member for a short time, but both of these extremists concluded that it wasn't enough. So, of course, the discussion is whether or not the mainstream discussion of immigrants and how we talk about them, they do obviously affect people also in the extremist environment.
Yeah.
But the anti-democracy conclusion they come to cannot follow from that, I think.
Bjorn, what are your thoughts on, because I know a lot of immigrants who live in Norway as well, and they do quite well for themselves within Norwegian society. What is the relationship, just put this into context for us, between the migrant community within Norway and authorities? Is there tension there, and what's the root of that tension then?
So I think the migrant community in Norway is, a lot of members of that community are doing really well and having good lives in Norway and being members of our society in every feasible way. There is, however, a lot of tension at the verbal and narrative level, as well as when it comes to fairly hardline migration policies that makes it very hard to come to Norway as a result of the discourse surrounding migration. And I think a lot of that is very fear-based. It's very based on a thinking of Norway as somewhat an exclusive club that it's hard to become a member of. It's also a result of a lot of fear-based narratives that we see across all of the West right now, and that we have seen for the last couple of decades, and perhaps especially after the rise of ISIS and all of the things we saw with both foreign fighters and Islamist terrorist attacks in Europe during those years.
So then Martine then leads to the very basic question: do you think authorities are well placed to deal with this right-wing threat? Then, I mean, now that we've had this trial and it's beginning now, do you think that there'll be an example almost made of for the rest of society, for them to know that this sort of hate is unacceptable for Norway?
I think all authorities struggle on how to meet extremism, and the Norwegian authorities do as well. Because how to meet this kind of new form for terrorism is hard. We know that the main discussion affects how people think, but what's new about these kinds of environments is that they meet internationally and virtually, and get nurtured and radicalized quite fast from that. So we are trying to find new ways of handling it, both before and after the radicalization. But we're not quite through with that. We aren't. We have been discussing how to meet. For instance, new ways to meet with anti-Muslim ideas in certain areas of society, and we are working on that from, or the authorities are, which of course will be one important way to work with these environments. But police says that compared to the former neo-Nazis in the 90s, they were much easier to deal with because they had to meet in person. They knew who were part of the environment and so on. And these new anti-Muslim and new form for neo-Nazis, they aren't as easy to spot. And you only need one lonely guy sitting in front of his computer and radicalizing himself. And that is, of course, much harder just or to see and to handle.
Bjorn, as a final comment then, I'll ask you about the dark web then, right? Because that is where, as we know, a lot of these sort of conversations happen, which then radicalize these youth or others of different age categories. Do you think that Norway, Europe, the West is willing to deal with that dark web? I mean, that's probably, I imagine, quite a tall task.
Is kind of a cheap out. Like, it's easy to blame the dark web, but the dark web is just a manifestation of fragments of our societies in many ways. And then we have to look at the direct connections between things like members of parliament holding essentially the same views on migration and on Muslim communities as are held by these extremists, and see how that validates their belief system. The members of parliament do not, of course, condone violence, but like a lot of them hold the same fundamental views about people from different cultures, from different religions, etc. And so I think we need to look more systemically at our society and at how our communities, both the ones that are more hidden in spaces like the dark web and the ones that are fairly open in the public discourse and public debate, as well as in our kind of chambers of power, we have to look at that as a whole and see where is it that we are doing something wrong? Where is it that we are essentially in some ways allowing for people to radicalize into a belief system where they become entrenched, where they become hateful, and eventually some of them become violent.
I believe there's a final word, and we of course appreciate both Bjorn and Martine for their time today, speaking to us there from the Norwegian capital Oslo and giving us context about this issue and about what the right-wing movement is like right now when it comes to Norway. We've had now 2 major cases, right, coming out of Norway. The biggest one, of course, was Anders Behring Breivik, and the many casualties that resulted as a result of his attack many years ago. And then now we've had this attack by Philip Mesjas just last year itself at the Al-Noor Islamic Center. Luckily, no one at the Islamic Center itself was killed. However, Philip had killed his own ethnic stepsister, right? Chinese ethnic stepsister, I should say, at home before he went out looking to kill Muslims as well by entering that Islamic Center. All of this is a disturbing pattern for the country and for the West, isn't it? Where it seems that the West has been caught off guard when it comes to this right-wing extremism at this point in time, or maybe not. Maybe that's just a reading that we have as sitting in our vantage point. Maybe the West is dealing with this in some way. I mean, after all, we are seeing this trial, but will this trial really result in a precedent being set for politicians as well, as Bjorn there mentioned, to reel in their hateful rhetoric towards migrants, towards Muslims, towards minorities of all sorts? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss disturbing statistics coming out of the United Kingdom, which say that in England and Wales, and this is according to the Office for National Statistics, black men and women are nearly twice as likely to die of coronavirus as white people in England and Wales, as I said. When you take into account certain factors, that number even goes up as high as 4 times. There's also within these statistics, also the South Asian community or those of South Asian descent within the UK also who are at heightened risk of dying from coronavirus. Now, some of the arguments being made are that possibly these minority communities are the ones who are more on the front line, i.e. Uber drivers, nurses, etc., frontline staff, and even in hospitals in many regards, and that the government needs to then act to protect them even further and even more than they would others. There's also talk of just socioeconomic issues that have existed for many, many years within those communities, and the fact that the government has not been able to then spread out equally, be it health facilities or otherwise, to these respective communities also. Let's discuss that further with our panelists who are joining us today. We're now joined by Priscilla Nwikpo, who is an award-winning broadcaster, political and public affairs analyst. She's joining us now from London. Joining us from Essex is Umar Kankiya, who is a former lawyer. He's now a youth and communication specialist. He's a former mental health lawyer and works now with young people and media on social issues. Also joining us from the British capital is Terry Logun, who is the host at eMedia Connect, which is an online talk radio and podcast. Terry, Omar, and Priscilla, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Terry, let me start with you. What do you make of these statistics? Across the board, it seems everybody in government is quite concerned about this.
I think it's early days to start making a lot of assumptions where this facts are emerging from, because again, looking at it from my perspective, I would like to see more data. Now, yes, it's been put out there that there are certain socioeconomic issues that will drive the death occurring from BAME people with ethnic minority, but the fact still remains that it's early days. What I can say for a fact is, suddenly, if you look at Asian countries in totality, we're not having the same death occurring in China, going by the recent reports. Now, China being part of an Asian country, we then need to start looking at what are the underlying factors that are driving this death.
Indeed. And Omar, what are your thoughts on that? Because there's also an argument made about just the health issues that may exist within these communities. I'm just picking out one thing, of course, and you can choose to talk about another one, but the health issues, for example, within some of these communities are such as diabetes, health issues, heart issues, pardon me, etc. Do you think that plays a huge part in all of this, that may be the reason why we're seeing these statistics?
Yeah, so I think there definitely is an issue around, for example, for a lot of BAME communities, there is a pre-existing conditions that are out there. I do accept that. But I do think we have to look at the economic side of things, because statistically, when you look at the highest level of COVID-19 deaths that are occurring in the UK, they seem to be happening in areas where there are high levels of social deprivation and high levels of ethnic minorities that are living in these particular areas. I'll take the London Borough of Newham, for example. Now, this is an area which has got the highest level of COVID-19 deaths in the country, in the borough itself, but it's also one of the highest ranking areas that has ethnic minorities that are living there as well. So I think there is definitely, as has been said, it is early days to understand really what the information is that is coming out from the government. However, I think, visibly we can see from the newspaper articles that have been printed, from pictures that have been printed, it is clear that BAME are disproportionately being affected by COVID-19 in comparison to their white counterparts. I take the point about information not being reported in places like China, and again, I think places in Africa as well. There is we don't have enough information. However, I would kind of take the view that the difference between what's happening in Africa and China and what's happening here is, obviously in the UK, there's more of an accountability when it comes to reporting these types of information. Whereas I think in places, in different African countries, for example, the people are dying all the time. But, if they don't have the money to be able to access hospitals or medical care, then how do we know whether it's COVID-19 related or other factors? So, these are the types of things that we have to take into consideration.
Indeed. Priscilla, what are your thoughts on that? What do you think may be the causes of this? Is it, as Terry and Omar there have said, too early to make a complete judgment on this?
Thank you very much for having me. I agree that perhaps it may be too early, but I also think that it's interesting to look at the factors that was looked into. They looked into communities, they looked into wealth, they looked into health, they looked into education and living arrangements. And, it was then concluded that, black men and women are 4 times likely to die. As you said, Bangladeshi and Pakistani male were 1.8 times likely to die. Yeah. Females are 1.6. And then, we looked at the fact that 21% of the NHS staff are made up of ethnic minorities. But then they only make up 14% of the population. I think that there is one other factor that could have been looked at, for instance, to ask the question, the level of care. What kind of care did they receive when they were unwell in hospital? What was the standard there? I accept that perhaps, they don't have the same level of wealth, or maybe, their diet contributes to their health. We're more prone to diabetes, we're more prone to certain other ailments. I'm not sure where our education comes in to play with the impact of COVID. But I certainly, yes, socioeconomic disadvantage, that has always been there. The system is set up in that way for us anyway. But when we speak of being affected by the virus in this manner, in the UK as well as in the US, we have to begin to ask the question, what is the standard of care that they were getting when they became ill? We also have to ask the question, we're very aware that they're the ones who are likely to be at the front line. And when you speak to those who are working within these hospitals, you will find out that the men and women of the BAME community who are healthcare professionals are working more hours. They're the ones more likely to, work longer hours and longer days.
Right.
Their white counterparts will, say that they're unwell, for instance, and they'll be self-isolating, and they are the ones who are left to carry the toll. So I think we need to look at the impact of that as well.
Definitely. Terry, what are your thoughts about the comparison that's been making with, that people are making with the U.S.? As you know, the statistics there, too, are not good for the Black community, the African-American community within the U.S. Do you think that there is a comparison to be made between what's happening in the U.K. and the U.S.?
Well, the state of New Jersey that comes to mind, where there's a disproportionate amount of Black people living, and the COVID-19 death, I think if I'm going by the statistics that I picked up, is quite high. Now, when we revisit, and in times to come, there are going to be a lot of issues, and years to come, there are going to be a lot of information that we're going to be bombarded with concerning why did we lose so many people from the ethnic minority. Now, my viewpoint still remains the fact that should we at this point in time withdraw the sole number of people who are working with the health, working in frontline workers, should we withdraw them from the system, we're going to have a total collapse of the health system, going by the number of people who work in these areas. However, in the future, I think research would definitely direct us to the reasons. It could be underlining health issues. It could be underlining, health care that's afforded by Black people. I think in the future, all these answers will be answered. But I still maintain it's early days to start jumping into conclusion.
Okay, so Umar, let's talk on the very vital, of course, contribution that a lot of these communities, the BAME communities, of course, have when it comes to the NHS and other such, very vital services within the UK. Do you think that at the very least, and I know that there has been some talk about that by some politicians, that these people need, at the very least, more protective equipment?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that we, the government have absolutely failed when it's come to the issue of PPE here in the country. I mean, I read yesterday that the shipment that came in from Turkey, that the Secretary of State for Communities, the Housing Communities and Local Government purchased on behalf of the UK government was faulty, and stuff like this is unacceptable. And I think we have been aware of this pandemic now for a number of months. And I do believe that the government have been extremely slow in how they've handled this situation. Things like going into lockdown, the measures around that, and even the fact that, tomorrow the Prime Minister is going to be going on national television to explain how we are looking to kind of start to relax some measures of the lockdown that's out there at the moment. And I think the issue of PPE is extremely important. And I think we shouldn't be fooled by the fact that, yes, although we have, we've gone past the peak and things are starting to come down, that shouldn't just be the reason why we should kind of ignore that very vital issue. And I think, you do read of stories of nurses and doctors having to reuse PPE equipment, having to hold their breath in some instances, and kind of how they're dealing with that. So I think that with the easing of lockdown measures that are due to happen in the next 48 hours, I think one of the things the government need to get clear and make sure that they make happen very quickly is to stockpile that level of PPE, so that when we do hit a second wave, do believe that that's going to happen later on in the year, that we are much better equipped and much better ready, so that hopefully we will see a reduction in the number of BAME-related and generally COVID-19 related deaths that are happening in this country.
All right, Priscilla, I'll give you the final. We just have about a minute left. Do you think that Britain now in the year 2020 or even next year, 2021, when hopefully we'll be post-COVID and we'll be speaking about the post-COVID world, do you think that Britain is well placed to finally deal with the issues that may exist, social and economic even issues within these BAME communities that have been, as you also said earlier, so long-standing?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for them to take the bull by the horn, as it were, and to finally face the issue. We can't continue, as we have done over the years, to ignore these issues or to dismiss or to speak of them as though they weren't in existence as abundantly as they are. And I think that COVID-19, what this is now doing is just throwing everything up. It's opening up all the cans, it's exposing areas, and it's calling for attention. So I believe it's imperative on the government to not shy away, but to tackle these issues with real sincerity. And I think that when that is done, because the BAME community are a valuable community to the British economy, to the society, they contribute, a wealth of so many things to the society. So that should be taken into consideration.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate Priscilla, Umar, and Terry for their time today, for giving us their expert insight on this issue. As I said in my introduction, the statistics when it comes to Black Britons dying, or the possibility of them dying from coronavirus as being twice or even, in some cases, 4 times more than others, is specifically, of course, their white counterparts. That's significant. And this is, again, comparable to what's happening in the United States as well. Where are these countries going wrong when it comes to how they deal with their minority communities, ethnic minority communities? Because we also have within the UK South Asian males, specifically those Bangladeshi, Pakistani Indians, who are also at risk from coronavirus more so than, again, their white counterparts. What exactly is going on here? Is it just underlying health conditions? Is it socioeconomic conditions? Something needs to be done because, again, as all of our guests are mentioned, these communities, these BAME communities, as they're known, provide a vital role within NHS. So they are the frontline staff that NHS and medical staff, they're really dependent on these people to provide the medical care that everyone needs, especially right now. So they need to be better protected, and this needs to be dealt with. The root causes of this issue need to be dealt with post-COVID-19 or starting now itself. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the incursion plot, or as it's known, Operation Gideon, or the Makuto Bay raid, depending on how you want to name it, that occurred the 3rd and 4th of May in Venezuela, where a number of Venezuelan dissidents, as well as 2 ex-American soldiers, were caught by the Maduro authorities trying to enter the country and possibly overthrow the Maduro government. There was also then a release of a 42-page document, their confession on state media in Venezuela, as well as now also a recording has been released between Guaido, who, as we know, is the opposition leader, or according to some countries, the legitimate leader of Venezuela. There's a recording between Guaido as well as the gentleman who heads Silver Corps, who is at the root of this entire plan, as well as, I should say, a Venezuelan ex-general, Major General Cliver Alcala Cárdenas, who planned out this entire thing, seemingly, again, to overthrow the Maduro government. Guaido himself has not addressed these accusations directly, just saying that he's being persecuted and he has dared Maduro to arrest him and detain him at this time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Alex Crowther, who is a research professor at Florida International University. He has 15 years of experience on the ground in Latin America and several decades of experience working on national security issues. He's joining us now from Miami. Joining us from Barcelona, Spain, is Luis Castro, who is a journalist, Latin American analyst, TV producer, and presenter. Luis and Alex, thank you both for your time today. Alex, let me start with you. What do you make of this entire plot? Do you believe that at some level the U.S. government would have at the very least been aware?
So U.S. policy is that we don't do that type of stuff at this point. Although we did do clandestine operations in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954, we haven't done these since the Cold War. It's actually against the law to plot against a foreign government ever since the Neutrality Act of 1794. And so I expect to see some prosecutions out of this. Also, if the American government was involved, you wouldn't see that picture of that passport right there. There's enough talent in the American government that they would not do an operation that was so ham-handed.
Indeed, that's thing that struck me, Luis, is that all of this seemed kind of amateurish, doesn't it?
Well, not really. The problem is that you need to understand what is going on inside the opposition in Venezuela. What's happening here is that they are actually fighting each other at the moment, and they've been fighting each other for a long time, to the point that back in January, the National Assembly in Venezuela elected actually a new set of leaders, and the opposition led by Juan Guaido didn't even recognize them. So the opposition is fractured into what is called the Guaido lovers, basically, people that only follow whatever Guaido agenda is, and other members of the opposition, and nevertheless, obviously, the government of Nicolás Maduro. Now, I have to start by saying that implying that the United States government doesn't know anything is an absolute fallacy, because, first of all, since when the United States doesn't know anything about what's happening internationally, nevertheless, with people and interests that they are actually paid for. Let me remind the people, or the people that don't know, that the United States government does have an institution called USAID, which they use, and it's actually written on their website, so it's not something that I'm making up, that they provide funds to multiply and encourage democracy and all these things that they always claim for before actually invading places that they don't like. And they have given, and I have the point here, $656 million to Juan Guaido's opposition since 2017. So obviously, the fact that Pompeo says that he might not know this operation like directly, of course he is aware of what's going on.
You know, I know you're not here as a spokesperson for the U.S. government, so I won't put you in that position. But do you think, at the very least, Alex, in some ways, that this has backfired on whoever planned it, be it Guaido, be it this gentleman who heads Silver Corps, in the sense that this does strengthen Maduro's hand, right? Now, I imagine this would turn off a lot of Venezuelans.
So this does strengthen Maduro's hand. You'll notice he blamed all the usual suspects, the U.S. government, the Colombian government, et cetera, and he's going to use this as an excuse to crack down even more. In terms of democracy support, sure, USAID does that. That's part of their job. The State Department does that. It's routine, but that's designed to build parties and things like that, not to overthrow governments.
But then do you think it's place, Alex, of the U.S. government to be getting involved in how other countries are governed?
So the U.S. is involved in trying to resolve the situation in Venezuela in support of the Lima Group, which is, 15 different countries, mostly from Latin America and including Canada. They're in the lead for the Organization of the American States, and the United States has said very clearly that we're in support of the Lima Group. Also, it's ludicrous to think that President Trump has time or interest right now with coronavirus and a re-election coming up that he would be even thinking about Venezuela at this point.
Okay, Luis, let's move beyond right now, just at the moment, but beyond the Venezuela versus U.S. narrative right now. How do you think the consequences of this entire incursion attempt will play out within Venezuela. It does strengthen Maduro, does it not, and weakens Guaido?
That is if you ever think that Juan Guaido has any strength. Like, Juan Guaido is just a puppet of the United States, period. So at this point, who is getting weakened is actually Juan Guaido. And once again, I'm going to refer to words given by the United States government, not by myself or any of the government of Nicolas Maduro, when Elio Abrahams in March actually said that they will support elections in Venezuela, while if Nicolas Maduro and Juan Guaido himself will sort of like step away from it. So they are even putting the finger down to Juan Guaido because they realize that it's not meeting the target. So at the moment, what is happening is that the general attorney in Venezuela has obviously put a red alert on Interpol into several subjects, including JJ Rendon, and some of the people that are seen as signing this contract with Silver Corp, as you mentioned. So yeah. I doubt that the Venezuelan government really is going to step any further than actually cracking down on the revolt. That let me make this clear. Colombia is involved on this. These mercenaries were training in Colombia, and it's actually been said by them. There are several. They have given so many interviews to the press media in Miami, which is their allies, and they are actually telling the whole story. And they did have a camp in Colombia, which is where they come from. And Jordan Goudreau, the CEO of this company, Silver Corp, he actually said that the revolt will come from south, east, and west of Venezuela. So at the moment, even until yesterday, the Venezuelan government is still cracking down on people associated to this plot in several points of the country. So the movement is still going on over there.
Alex, I think that it was a misstep in some regards on the part of the U.S. to support Juan Guaido. I mean, he hasn't really succeeded in the stated goal, right?
So, the United States government supports political parties around the world that are dedicated to democracy, right? And so Juan Guaido, several years ago, was elected as the Speaker of the Congress. And when Maduro stole the last election, he was the senior Venezuelan politician who was actually legitimately elected to his position. And so that's why the U.S. government supported him, along with, 50 other organizations around the world. And so the United States government, I know from reading the releases, is dedicated to a peaceful resolution of the Venezuelan political system. It's got to be a political solution, not a military solution. And we're working in support of the Lima Group, who is an international group that is dedicated towards taking care of this. So Guaido is an actor, and the U.S. government sees him as the senior, legitimately elected Venezuelan official.
Okay, Louis, give me the final word. We just have about a minute and a half left, Max. Do you think that there is a solution that can be found just within Venezuela itself, between Venezuelans themselves, even possibly between Guaido and Maduro at this time?
Well, I don't know about between Guaido and Maduro, because basically there have been so many negotiations and many sort of like tables for like chatting and trying to resolve this issue, and it's never gone anywhere. However, the government of Venezuela, talking about Nicolas Maduro because the other one is not government of anything, the government of Venezuela have said, and they already explained, that this year there should be parliamentary elections. The only problem is that because of the COVID-19 crisis, as any other elections in the world, including the United States, is under circumstance that we don't really even know if they're going to go ahead. The Americans cannot even say if they're going to have elections as they had planned this year. In Bolivia, they also lost the election that they had in May. So the COVID-19 is changing a little bit of situation, but the plan is to have elections for a new National Assembly in Venezuela, as it is scheduled on time, as the last election was in 2015, and they should be renewed every 5 years. So depending on what the people of Venezuela say on these elections, Juan Guaido and his people will remain or not within the National Assembly at that point. But other than that,
Very well.
I see that the Venezuelan government itself is very solid at the moment, despite all the efforts from Colombia, from the United States, and from Miami, and from the opposition to overthrow
Indeed.
the government. They have made it very clear that it's not going to happen.
All right, we appreciate that. We'll leave that as our final word. We appreciate both Luis and Alex for their time today and, of course, for their important insight into Venezuela and what's occurred there over the past number of days, as well as what may occur coming forward as well. I'm sure to give you both sides of the argument, of course, because there are two different sides of this. One side, of course, supports Guaido, and the other side continues to support Maduro as a legitimate leader. Nevertheless, this incursion did occur, or there was at least an incursion plot, a plot to overthrow Maduro. Did the U.S. government know? Did the U.S. government not know? Did Colombia know? Did Colombia not know? Those are all very important details because that affects what then happens just within Venezuela itself, Guaido's own standing, if he has any or does. Again, that's up to people who have that vantage point to decide. And then, of course, what happens vis-a-vis a resolution of this political crisis in the country, because this has gone on for so long now that I wonder if any of the external players who may be involved will continue to hold on to whatever aspirations they may have within the country, and as well as those within the country as well. Do we not need some sort of a resolution between all Venezuelans to move the country forward and to move beyond this to resolve the many issues that the country faces? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.